Living in the Past is a Turtle, Mysteries of Azeroth, and Everlook Broadcasting production. This is Living in the Past, your Everlook Broadcasting Company weekly show about all things Turtle, Mysteries of Azeroth. Today is Friday, October 27th, 2023, and I'm Dan, your host for the next hour. Happy Friday, Turtle Wow. It's the end of the week once again, and that means we get to soak up the great vibes and prepare for a stellar weekend. It also means that, once again, I've got an entire platoon of rabid, unappreciated gnomes that I've locked Zappo in one of the back studios with. We'll try and wrap up the show before he starts to like them, or they consume his flesh. Either way, that works for me. What plans do you have? Anything you're working on, perhaps? I've been spending the little spare time I've had working on my Fury Warrior. Nearly at 60, nearly there. It's 59 now. And getting the hit rating I need to step into Molten Core, the 20-mans, and possibly even Kara. We'll see about that. He's a goblin, so I'm sticking with maces, and yeah, that includes mace smithing because I'm that kind of crazy and masochistic. I'm only worrying about 6% hit to start with because I'm a goblin, and I'm sticking with maces and daggers. So between all the new gear available on Turtle, the alternative tier sets coming up, and the great folks I get to raid with on a regular basis, I'm stoked to start switching the Goblin in for some of the lower tier raids coming up here next week. It's so much fun to actually be playing a Fury Warrior again regularly. You heard me talk in my first episode about how I very much played Warrior through most of my history of Warcraft from 2004 on. Shadow Priest has been an anomaly for me. I'm not a caster normally. I don't play casters. That's not how my brain functions. The Shadow Priest has been so weird. And while I'm grateful to be playing her and actually have like a high tier caster raider right now, and also being a Shadow Priest is intensely satisfying when you see your group nearly full mana, nearly full health, through a nasty raid encounter, and other groups are struggle bussing to stay up. That feels really good. But honestly, getting back to a Fury Warrior has just been the satisfaction of knowing exactly where to stand, knowing your weapon swing times, and setting yourself up for success and taking the time to prep, and then just demolishing things. I make the joke all the time of will it blend? And I know people are getting bored of it. people are getting really bored of it. But I still make it because that joy of hitting your whirlwind and seeing at least a couple crits pop up and getting the flurry proc off of it. There is nothing in WoW that will really surpass that regular satisfaction for me. That just tickles my brain. It makes my brain feel good in all the right ways. Again, not that I don't like the priest. The priest is wonderful. I love playing a Shadow Priest. And learning the differences between Shadow Priest and other offensive caster classes has been a joy. It's been weird because the only offensive caster class I've really dived into previously is Fire Mage. And you need a lot of hit and a lot of crit to support Fire Mage, pretty much no matter what expansion you're talking about. And Priest, Shadow Priest can't use crit. For those that don't know, Shadow Priest can't really use crit because out of your regular rotation, the only abilities that can really crit are Mind Blast and Pain Spike, and Pain Spike you really only use as like a mini Shadow Word Death almost. It's not really useful to use otherwise if you're not going to get the kill within a couple seconds. It's strange. It's strange having to be a caster but looking at pretty much just pure spell power and not much else. Like, I'm supposed to be worrying about these other things. I'm supposed to be concerned about these other things, and I'm not. And it's not like I don't have any hit, rather. Hit you do need some of, but your talents give you most of the hit that you need. And while a couple hit, I like to float between 14 and 16 myself. There's no reason to go past that. There's none. There's absolutely none. You have no reason to go past 16 hit ever. Hell, 16 hit is a lot. So you got to get the idea. It's been odd. But my brain is really kind of like set for Fury, where I know the exact pieces I need, although with Turtle that's being switched up immensely and in very odd ways. It's just like where my brain is. I know the weapon speeds I need. I know where to float my hit rating, depending upon where I want where I need it to be for my crit. And this is big, I obey my weapon skills. Anyone who is worth their salt as a melee class will understand what I'm saying here. You must obey your weapon skills. Goblin, I rolled Goblin for a very specific reason, and it's because I wanted to experiment with weapons I normally don't use as a Fury Warrior. Like, tanks will usually pick up a dagger at some point. Corehound Tooth, Perdition's Blade, just talking about MC options. They're things that tanks will generally pick up at some point. May not mainline for a while, but at least have as an option. They won't do that if they're Fury, though. If they're Fury, you may pick up the Corehound gloves, or on Turtle, one of the other dagger specific skill pieces, but you're going to obey your innate weapon skills on your class. So for humans, for example, maces and swords. For orcs, axes. There are a few other possibilities, but at least on Turtle, that's kind of where they lie. So you're going to obey your innate weapon skills. I'm excited for what is to come with the Goblin, because it opens up a lot of different options. And again, as long as you float your hit rating to the appropriate levels and make sure it stays up where it needs to be with your crit, because based on traditional classic and vanilla crit tables, you need certain amounts of hit in order to utilize higher levels of crit. It's a lot, but again, those that actually have played Melee for a while will understand what I'm talking about. I don't do a great job of describing this, but I do love it. I love it so much. So looking forward to that. That's going to be a ton of fun. You know what else is a ton of fun? PvP. PvP is a lot of fun. Telebeam has launched, and I've already seen a few folks complaining about how full it is and how all the good names have already been taken. I tried to grab Leto over there, already was gone a few minutes after launch. So hey, whoever sniped that, proud of you. Of course, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I expect people to continue to complain about these things. That's okay. Having played on more than a few PvP servers in my past, my homes for the longest time were Laughing Skull US, as well as Maelstrom, one of the first RP PvP servers. I've got some pretty fond and not so fond memories of being on PvP servers. Playing a warrior on a PvP server is never an easy life. You're at the behest of almost any caster. Hunters and paladins tend to mess you up. And while any rogue that thinks they can get the better of you is just lying to themselves, most of the time it's little consolation for a class that sometimes felt excessively easily manipulated by other classes. I complain now, sure, but in all honesty, many times, at least when I got the jump on a Clothy, it was 3 swings and they were on the floor, so I don't have a lot of room to complain. Now, I mentioned Laughing Skull as my original home server. Another group that made their home on Laughing Skull was, unfortunately, Pals for Life. For those that don't remember, Pals for Life was the guild that the infamous Leroy Jenkins was a part of, as well as made their nonsensical UBRS, at least I got chicken skit. You may be thinking, oh hey, I wonder if Dan ever ran into him. No, I didn't. I did not. But I did run into Pals for Life a few times as a Horde player. Pals for Life was alliance. While not the most egregious corpse campers on the server, there were groups on both Horde and Alliance that are far worse than them. I can safely say both Hillsbrad and Tanaris had quite a few of my corpses that they stomped all over more than a few times. They're probably still sitting out there. So, if you're heading out on Telebeam, here's some important things I want you to keep in mind. When in contested territory, stay with your group. A group of you is a much better method to ward off other people. If individuals see a group moving together and staying focused, that's an automatic red flag of, okay, give them space. You don't want to, interrupt what they're doing or disrupt them in some way. So if you stay with your group and don't just wander off, oh shit, I see a mining node over there. Don't you do that. Or communicate with your group and say, hey, I want to go get that mining node. Let's go. Stay with your group. It's so much more effective than going solo. Also, speaking of coordinating, coordinate with your party and guild. And this goes more than just communication. This is organization we're talking about here. A group of 5 warriors isn't going to do nearly as much good as a well-balanced group. I want the shaman, rogue, druid, warrior, and priest. A well-balanced group. Balance your groups and figure out who's doing what and where for the day. That means talking with your guild, actually figuring out who needs to get what done. One thing I've talked about previously, not here, but in much earlier iterations of my broadcasting, the more that you are put in situations where PvP is an issue, where you're actually dealing with enemy factions and you're dealing with enemy organization, you're forced to think in better and different ways. Pressure and restriction creates creative thinking, essentially. And I'm sure there's science behind that in some place. I just don't know about it. But kind of doubling down on this point, if you're put in situations where you're under pressure, and everyone has just had under pressure put in their head, so you're welcome. You're welcome on that. The more you're put in those situations, the more you have to think about what you're doing. The more you have to organize. The more you have to work together as a guild, as a faction. You're forced to think in these higher ways and these stronger ways on a more regular basis. The more you do it, the more it becomes habit. The more it becomes habit, the more you use it as a tool versus a struggle. And while it can be a struggle to, get things done on a PvP server, at the same time, it puts you in a situation where you're learning to work together better. You're learning these cohesions. You're learning who you can trust to actually get the job done with you. So these are great things. These are great things to end up working on if you can take the heat. Sometimes when you can't take the heat, when you cannot contest a leveling zone or area, don't hesitate to go somewhere else or grind something else. Discretion is the better part of valor sometimes. Don't be afraid to say, okay, there's too many dudes doing things we don't like over there. We cannot contest it. Instead of bashing your head on that, go do something else. Go work on something else. The world is big. Don't feel like I have to get this one thing done right now or my life will be over. Because if you get stuck in that mindset, you're just creating resistance for yourself, and resistance only builds frustration. Don't build frustration on yourself. Also, when it comes to resistance, health is the best thing you can do, that you can have, to resist an enemy. The bigger your health pool is, the more you can survive. That's true in every aspect of WoW, but especially in PvP. So, while you may want to get the biggest and best damage gear or the most healing possible on your gear, don't skimp on the stamina. Stuff like Devil Saur may be great for DPS, but when it comes to PvP, you want stamina, you want armor. Do not ignore that. You need health to survive. And speaking of survival, another piece of gear you want to make sure you get as soon as humanly possible, and I mean as soon as you can pick it up, as soon as you can buy it, get the PvP trinkets. This isn't for every class. Some classes it isn't as good, but by and large, you want your PvP trinket badly. Pick up your PvP trinket as soon as possible. Keep it on you. If you're out in the open world, you want it equipped. Period. Just do it. Last point I really want to make here is communicate. I touched on this briefly, but I'm going to double down on it in a different way. Communicate with your faction. Know which guild leaders and which officers need to know things. There are certain guilds that are going to come out of the woodwork that are going to be better at assisting people when needed, or are going to be more reactive when PvP pops up. So learn the guilds that are going to be reactive to world PvP. Learn the people who are going to respond on a regular basis, and figure out what methods of communication your faction wants to use. Don't be afraid to hop in a channel and figure out who's talking about what and what's important to them. The more you learn your faction and more you learn how to talk to them, the better you're going to be able to organize and coordinate with your faction. And I hate to use this term, but at the end of the day, you must fight faction to faction. That's required. That is a required part of being on a world PvP server. So don't be afraid to learn about how the factions want to communicate, how your faction wants to communicate, and get in there and talk to them. If people don't know that the other faction is fighting control for this, questing area, or trying to keep people out from this zone, or trying to control these resource spawns or herb spawns in some way, if you don't communicate that to the rest of your faction, there's no way your faction can get in and try to solve the problem. Communicate with your faction, provide information. That's massive. And lastly, real quick, if the struggle is hitting you really hard, because sometimes PvP can be really frustrating, especially world PvP, don't be afraid to say, you know what, gotta pull back, gonna just grind an instance or two. And tell your group, hey, let's go do this instead. This is getting really frustrating. Don't be afraid to hit a cooldown period, because you want to be ready to go when your faction really needs you. And if you're not continuously leveling and getting stuff done, you're not going to be ready. So never be afraid. Instead of stepping away from the game and just rage quitting, do something productive. Do instances. Step out of the world and just get stuff done and kind of do a reset, a personal reset. That's my thoughts on world PvP, and that's a lot of the stuff that helped me survive. I hope everyone rolling over on Telebeam has an incredible time, and I look forward to seeing how the progression on the server plays out. And more than anything else, a salute to all the staff here at Turtle for getting the on-time launch done for all of us to enjoy. They've done an incredible job. Blood and honor. Many times, I like to use music to take us back to times that we fondly remember in the history of the Warcraft universe. And today, I've picked a very specific song to open up our first break with. Mr. Voltron was well known to make some truly zany tracks, but he also made some more serious and heartfelt remixes. My favorite of his was Reply Code Alpha, using assets and audio from the Algalon fight in Ulduar, part of Wrath of the Lich King, which we'll open this break up with. The second track for this break is a throwback to the original RTS games and a little nudge towards what we'll be talking about in our second segment. At the end of Warcraft 3, an as of yet unnamed internal to Blizzard band recorded a single track as a fun bit to put as an Easter egg after the completion of the Frozen Throne campaign. This group, led by Samwise and Metzen, would eventually be called Level 10 Elite Tauren Chieftain, and would have a whole song catalog of great original WoW tracks. More Living in the Past coming up after our first break, which concludes with Power of the Horde. The musical tracks for this episode have been removed due to YouTube copyright. To listen to the full episodes with music, tune in to Everlook Broadcasting every Friday with the in-game radio widget. This isn't the last time you're gonna hear insert level number here, Elite Tauren Chieftain on Living in the Past. As I mentioned earlier, they have an incredible catalog of songs after their history as Blizzard's official internal band. While all of us clearly appreciate World of Warcraft vanilla in all of its buggy, incomplete, and sometimes illogical glory, I think many of us forget about the massive RTS franchise that came before we had an open world to explore. A personal history here for a moment, as I do constantly on Living in the Past here. My first computer game ever, my very first computer game ever, was the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans in 1994. I had played console gaming before that. ActRaiser was actually a huge favorite of mine as a kid growing up, which probably says something really bad about how my brain developed. Wow, a kid really likes this strategy city building game. What the heck? Warcraft Orcs and Humans has a very important place in my heart, and I think it's really important to highlight how vital this initial world building was for the franchise as a whole. Now, obviously, some things from the original RTSs is a very strange word, by the way. RTS games, we'll say. Some details happily got left out. A lot of what I do over on my YouTube page is actually analyze how things were translated from the RTS to the MMO. So this is actually something I've studied a lot. A lot of the original World of Warcraft Orcs and Humans actually cited the powers of hell as something that the orcs use for a lot of their magics. Their demons were cited as coming from that. Opposing that, for the human faction, there are many references, especially in the Warcraft manual, the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans manual, to the power of God as something that human clerics called upon. Which, yeah, that didn't last at all, ever. That didn't last long at all. We can see that changing even as we got into Warcraft 2. But nonetheless, there's so much from the original RTS games that I think we need to sometimes take a step back and appreciate. The RTS games eventually created these very strict defining lines that we follow between the factions. One thing that especially was highlighted in Warcraft 3 in particular is the difference between different kinds of armor. And that seems like a silly thing to highlight, but in Warcraft 1 and 2, the factions were mirrored, perfectly mirrored. An Orc Grunt and a Human Footman had the exact same stats. A Human Knight and an Ogre had the exact same stats. In Warcraft 3, we actually see a lot of that division and that difference coming out, where suddenly an Orc Grunt and a Human Footman were not on the same playing field. They not only did they have different food costs, but they had different gold and actual stats that really put them at different points. Human Footman is actually much weaker than an Orc Grunt. An Orc Grunt being seen as bigger, larger, stronger. We also saw a difference between the Human Knights and what was originally considered in the original RTS, or Warcraft Orcs and Humans, the polar opposite of it, the Wolf Rider. In Warcraft 3, when the Wolf Rider was brought back, suddenly it was not nearly as heavily armored. It didn't have nearly as big a health pool, And it didn't do nearly as much damage, but it had this giant siege blade, which it swung around. So suddenly it was doing siege damage instead and filled a very different role from the knight, the human knight, which, I'll be honest, was a carbon copy throughout all the games. A human knight was defined very early on and never really changed, ever. Except for, and I think this is why some people ask for flails still in Warcraft. In the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, knights used flails. They used gigantic flails. They didn't use lances. They didn't use swords. They used these giant flails, and that never really continued either. It would be hilarious to see flails in game, but I doubt it. I doubt it. So before I continue on this, show of hands in World Chat. Hey, World Chat. I see you guys. Hey, how you doing? How many of you played Warcraft 3? Just a yes or a wave, whatever. How many of you played Warcraft 2? Tides of Darkness. If you played the expansion as well, hey, props to you. The expansion was stellar. Beyond the Dark Portal was fantastic. How many of you played the original Warcraft Orcs and Humans, the one I've been talking about here so much? Have many of you? Have many of you experienced it? Another thing that did not get carried over at all from the original Warcraft RTS, which actually I wish it had, because I found it like a very interesting and enjoyable, like satisfying mechanic, was the road building. In the original Warcraft, all of your buildings had to be connected by roads. I loved it. I loved it so much. It was ridiculous, and it created this weird kind of Sim City effect with your settlements, because suddenly every building had this one block divide between it, and your units could get squished inside it very easily, whereas it was also like easy to defend through that if you had the right choke points. Anywho, there's so much good that came from the Warcraft RTSs. Dead Mines, the original Dead Mines, was actually in the original Warcraft RTS. Dead Mines was in there along with Karazhan. You actually had to go into Dead Mines on one of the human missions really quick. It's fascinating that it survived that long. Like, we don't hear about Dead Mines in Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3. We just don't. It doesn't really exist. But then in World of Warcraft, suddenly it was brought back. And I think that's fascinating. I love that. But you have to ask why. Like, I'm waxing nostalgic about this right now, but you have to ask why. Why are the original RTSs important? And it comes down to world building. You're going to hear me talk a lot about world building, and this is where we get the state of the world from. I mentioned Karazhan before. We got Karazhan from the original RTS. Stonard. All of you Horde that are in Stonard right now, you are in an original Horde settlement from the First War. That's been there this whole time. I don't know if it got wiped out or replaced during Warcraft 2, and when the orcs were pushed back to the Dark Portal. My guess is probably not. Of course, the world scale has changed dramatically between games, and that's a separate conversation to bring up entirely, but the fact of the matter is that Stonard was on the map from the original Warcraft. In addition, not only locations, but we get a lot of the concepts that we rely on. A lot of the classes that we play are based firmly, or sometimes not so firmly, in the lore from the original RTS games. Warriors, for example. Warriors take from a lot of different sources. Beyond the obvious, footmen, knights, grunts, things like that. They also take from Tauren Chieftain. They also take from Mountain Kings, which are not paladins. Some people think Mountain Kings, Dwarven Mountain Kings from Warcraft 3 were paladins somehow, and let me tell you what, that's not true. That is not true. There's so much, though, that we take from that. Shamans. Shamans are an amalgamation of witch doctors, spirit walkers from Tauren, and then Farseers for orcs, the hero unit. And you can see the direct translation of those abilities to these classes. If we hadn't had these units and these abilities and these classes, we would not have had these like classes in WoW in the first place. Someone had to do the work beforehand. Druids, taking a look at druids. Druids have such a diverse background. Not only do you have the two druid units, the druid of the claw and druid of the I forget the name of the druid that could transform into a bird from Warcraft 3. Goodness. Oh, my brain is blanking on it. But you also had the druid hero unit for night elves. And druids take from all three of those units in many different ways. And not necessarily just from vanilla itself, but as the classes evolved, we see more things slowly being integrated. One thing that I always like to bring up when talking about this is Bladestorm for warriors. Bladestorm was something that Blade Masters had. And good lord, if we had gotten a Blade Master class for Warcraft, for World of Warcraft, I would have been so happy. I wanted that so badly. That would have been fantastic. There's a few classes. There's a few classes I would want to see, especially if Turtle ever had the time to make custom classes. I have wanted to see as I mentioned earlier, a Mountain King class, kind of like a dual Mountain King and Tauren Chieftain class. I actually made a suggestion at some point to Turtle on that, and I had such a joy actually writing that design doc up. That was so much fun. I would love to see that. I would love to see more delineation as well between the different archetypes that went into Shaman as well. It would be so difficult, but unfortunately because Witch Doctor, Spirit Walker, and Farseer all got kind of boiled into one class, it would be difficult to separate them. But how fun would it be to actually be a legit Witch Doctor, like a troll Witch Doctor at some point? Or having a more specific Farseer shaman of some kind. Obviously, these ideas are things that probably will never be able to happen. But being able to speculate on these is an incredible time. I love doing this. This is one of my favorite things to just sit and think about. There were also, in my opinion, some mistakes when it came to translating the RTSs to the game itself. And not speaking like, oh, something might have been missed out, but more legitimate mistakes. And you've heard me talk about paladins beforehand. I have a lot of very unique thoughts on paladins. And if you want the full the 27-minute long conversation this turned into, please head over to my YouTube page. I have a long form video on this topic that I'm not going to reiterate here because I need to not be angry. But the way paladins were translated from Warcraft 3 to World of Warcraft felt like such a blasphemy for me. Using the light in a way to harm other living things is something that, up until World of Warcraft's launch, paladins were unable to do. It was not allowed. It's not like it wasn't a thing, because clerics from the original Warcraft had a Holy Lance ability that is kind of like Smite. Priests in Warcraft 3 had a different light-based auto attack that they could use. So it's not like, for some reason, we didn't know how to use the light in an offensive manner. It just wasn't allowed for paladins. Paladins were never able to do that. The only discrepancy in that is for Holy Light, the ability Holy Light in Warcraft 3, where Holy Light, if used on an undead, an enemy undead, would harm them. But that was only for undead. That was only for purging the undead from the land. On top of that, in Warcraft 2, you had Exorcism as well, which was translated to World of Warcraft effectively. But other than that, there's a lot going on there that I felt shouldn't have been. Again, if you want more of that conversation in the 27, 28-minute detailed discussion, go over to my YouTube page. I promote it at the end of the show, but I have that over there. With that being said, there is so much that I would encourage all of you to go and experience when it comes to the RTS games. They're out there. The RTS games are available to pick up at some sites for free. But they have just so much depth to them that it's difficult for me to communicate. But just experiencing them and seeing how they were translated into the World of Warcraft is fascinating. It is mind-opening, and I cannot encourage it enough. Now, in a change from our previous break, we're actually going to step out of the Warcraft universe and into a different beloved fantasy realm. Lord of the Rings has had some incredible memories, characters, scenes, and music. And while the later parts of the Hobbit movie franchise were not nearly as well received and honestly not very good, much of the music, especially from the first movie, was some incredibly fine work. I also know, for the record, that all of you out there really love dwarves and their musical chops. So, we'll be highlighting a pair of dwarven tracks from the Hobbit franchise. The first, which I expect most of you to know, is Misty Mountains Cold. And the second, which I don't think as many people may have heard, is the poem Durin's Song. Buffering this break as well is one of my favorite pieces from all the Lord of the Rings movies concerning hobbits. We'll be back after this for our final segment of Living in the Past, including a highlight of what's to come next week. The musical tracks for this episode have been removed due to YouTube copyright. To listen to the full episodes with music, tune in to Everlook Broadcasting every approach release. Well, good news, everyone! On next week's episode of Living in the Past, we're going to have an interview with someone from the itemization team to talk about the upcoming alternative gear sets. And while we may not answer every question or cover every topic, I'm excited to open up more information on a feature I'm incredibly excited for with you. I'll be asking questions on how we'll be able to acquire these new set pieces, how the stats and skins will be looking, and what kind of new set bonuses we can look forward to, and even some more in-depth questions on access to information on items and gear. The goal of this is to provide everyone here a window into how the dev team is functioning with these major developments for the server, and give you all an opportunity to be prepared for when 1.17.1 hits the live servers. As another update, Telebeam's launch has garnered a consistent peak of around 5K players. Congratulations to you all that have rolled on the server and are enjoying the action. As an additional update, I can confirm that on the primary Turtle server, soon to be retitled Nordinar, even though Gilneas was superiorly a better name, I'm just saying, Nordinar did not shut down or collapse, or suddenly become empty due to the launch of the new RP PvP server, so everyone can stop panicking now and go back to enjoying the game. You're welcome. Thank you for taking the time today to join me. Our nostalgia continues, even though today's broadcast is now at an end. And I hope you enjoyed the show here today. A huge thank you to the Turtle developers, moderators, staff, and volunteers. Without the entire team's hard work and dedication, we wouldn't have this station or this server group. An additional thank you to the audio engineers and creators here for the use of their soundtracks they've created, which we use for segment transitions and intro audio. If you'd like to find out more about what I do, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/TheDanNation and my series, Ancient Lore, a recapture of the spirit of my original podcast, The Ancient of Lore. Until next Friday, let's all keep living in the past.